And we're live. Rahul, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited for this.
Yeah. And first of all, do you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm Rahul. I am currently the co-founder and CEO of a company called Taro, which helps software engineers onboard and get promoted more quickly. But I've had my entire career in Silicon Valley in tech. So my most recent full-time job was at Facebook, or Meta, I should call it now. I was there for 4.5 years before I quit back in January. Um, and I did a bunch of stuff there. I was an Android engineer. I was a tech lead for our team, and I also did management. But prior to Facebook, prior to Meta, I was at Pinterest for 2.5 years. Prior to Pinterest, I was at a startup where I was a founding engineer. And then prior to Pinterest, I was at Stanford for 5 years. And in fact, the lab that I worked on at Stanford, that is the work from that lab turned into a startup, which got acquired by Pinterest. So that was kind of my journey into a full-time job. And I was at Stanford for 5 years. And so, yeah, I've seen a lot of, Silicon Valley grow and evolve in the past, I guess 13, 14 years. So it's been really interesting to be here.
Nice. So just based on what you just said, I have so much to ask, and so many things I'm curious about. What was that startup about that was acquired by Pinterest?
Yeah, so the startup was called Codebase, and it was about recommendation systems. So the lab that I was part of, it was basically a big data lab, which was already hot back in 2014, 2013 when I was in the lab, and also even perhaps more hot now. Like it's even more glamorous. But back then it was kind of exciting. Okay, like you have all this data, you have these social media companies which are producing literally terabytes or maybe petabytes of data about like all this traffic and all this, things that people have watched or clicked. How can we take that and turn it into something usable so we can recommend better content on YouTube or on Pinterest or on whatever website you can think of? And so we had some novel algorithms which were interesting intellectually, but hard to find, hard to turn that into an economically viable product. And so it basically became an acquihire. So an acquihire, for people who don't know, is basically there's not really a product to acquire, but the team of people who are building this startup are talented. And the company, the acquiring company, in this case Pinterest, wanted to grab all the engineering talent of Codebase. And so that's how I came on board.
Nice. Okay, so we have a lot to cover today. Getting multiple job offers from FAANG, how you did it, how other people might be able to do it, getting started on a new code base, and maybe if we have enough time, either something about building a startup or getting promoted as a software engineer. We'll see, or maybe both of them, hopefully. So let's just get right into it. How did you get multiple job offers from FAANG, and which companies were they?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is something I get a lot. So let me give the context. Because I've been in tech for so long, and I've went to school in the middle of Silicon Valley, I've had a ton of interview practice. And so I failed a bunch of interviews, but then eventually I got to the point where I got pretty good at them. So in 2013, I did a bunch of interviewing as I was graduating, and I got 5 offers: Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Square. And then again, I did another round of interviewing pretty deliberately in 2017 when I was leaving Pinterest, and I got 6 offers, like Uber, Facebook, which is where I ended up going, Airbnb, Stripe, and a couple others. But yeah, so basically I've been doing a bunch of interviewing, and I have a ton of opinions and a ton of context on what it takes to really crack the interview at these top companies. So I may not be able to give advice on, you shouldn't listen to me if you're like interviewing for like a 2-person startup, because oftentimes the advice for getting into a 2-person or 5-person startup is going to be very different from what we're talking about, which is like these big companies. And that's because, these big companies, they have to interview people at scale. They're talking about interviewing, I don't know, hundreds of people every month. And so there needs to be some sort of standardization. And that standardization is good for the candidate because now you know what to expect. And I got really good at predicting that and being able to talk to the interviewer, engage them, and do well both in the coding part and the non-coding part of the interview. And I was able to land a bunch of offers. So I'm happy to share a couple different high-level pieces of advice. And then if there's particular questions that people have, or if you have YK, then happy to dive in there as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. And feel free to share your screen, and let me know when you want to
Okay,
put
yeah,
the screen
sounds good.
be up there. Yep.
Well, so before I dive into the screen share, I think there's really two different parts of getting a job at FAANG. That's the question, right? How do you land the offer at FAANG? There are two very different parts. One is getting the interview, and one is getting the job, right? And so the reason I am very clear about making these distinct is because one of the harsh realities of interviewing in big tech is that the skill you need to interview is very different than the skill you need to get the interview. And so I can share my screen if you're okay with that. I can
Sure.
give you a bit more context.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're interview, if you're in school, the best way to get the interview is through career fair. You're in this really tight environment of many other people who are all ambitious and smart, and companies know that. So if you have a career fair, that's the best way to do it. If you're an intern, then you effectively already got your foot in the door, and you're doing a 3-month-long or a 2-month-long interview with the company. And so your priority as an intern should be just give everything you possibly can to the job to land that return offer. If you don't have one of these two things, you're not in school and you're not an intern already, then at that point, the number one thing you can do is really just to cultivate deep relationships with people and get referrals. Because the thing is that these top companies will get literally tens of thousands of applicants, and many of them are not even read. And so if you want a chance of getting your application actually read, then you need someone to vouch for you. You need someone to say, hey, I think YK, you're an amazing candidate based on my history with that person. And so what you should do is, work with people at your current company if you're working, and eventually one of them will go on to Google or Facebook and then ask them for a referral, or just go onto LinkedIn and actually try and make a meaningful connection with people. LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever community you have online, try and actually make a meaningful relationship with people. And so here's two things that I recommend strongly that here are two strong opinions I have. There are two things that people often do that I think are very indirect ways of getting the interview. One is open source, and the other is having a project. So in general, I would say 95% of the projects that I have reviewed when I was hiring at Pinterest and Facebook, they are not that impressive. Even the open source projects are not that impressive, right? And so, because the definition of a side project could literally be, I am going to make a hello world program for Android and we change the text to say goodbye world or whatever, right? And that's technically a side project, right? And so the default assumption for most people who are evaluating a side project or an open source contribution is that it's probably not that interesting. It's not that meaningful. And so the burden is on you to really go out of your way to prove that. And that's hard to do, right? So for example, if you have an Android app which is published and it has 10,000 or 100,000 users, now that's impressive because you've objectively built something that people find valuable. Or if you've actually made an open source contribution to React, right? That's huge because React I trust React that there's some validation of your code quality and your insight, right? But there needs to be some connection to something which I have faith in or I have trust in, right? That's actually the guiding principle for all of this. If you want to get an interview, you have to be connected with someone who, let's say you're trying to get an interview at my company. You have to have some authority vouch for you. An authority could be, hey, someone at my company right now said you're good. I trust that person. There's an open source project that I've heard of, or it's seems to be very popular, and you made a contribution there. Okay, now I kind of trust you. You yourself made an Android app or iOS app or some project which is used by thousands of people. Okay, I kind of trust you. Or you went to a good school. You went to, MIT or Harvard or, some similar school, okay, I definitely trust you. Because like I trust that there's some level of vetting that MIT does for their students that you're going to be competent, right? And so you have to be able to do that. What I have on the slide here is basically a bunch of different ideas for how do you build that authority and that trust. The top 3 are the easiest ways, and the bottom 2 are going to be a lot harder. So you probably should expect to spend at least 6 months or a year doing that. And so if your goal is I want to just get an interview in the next month or 2, the bottom 2 won't really help you.
Yep. Thank you for that. And just wanted to quickly add, I think open source contributions, it's not just about getting interviews, it's also, honing your skills, practicing your skills. So that's, one thing I wanted to add. And quick question for you. You mentioned LinkedIn. How would you use LinkedIn to network?
Yes. Okay. So LinkedIn, I think the big mistake that people make is that they will do very shallow connections. Like I get a ton of messages, probably like 4 or 5 messages a day, which basically say, hey, here's my resume. Do you have any opportunities for me? And I think the biggest mistake in general, not just with LinkedIn, but with email, with Twitter, anything, is you have to understand that people don't really care about you, right? When you're reaching out to someone, when you make a cold message, if you phrase it as hey, I'm looking for a job, can you help me? That's an immediate turnoff, right? So the better way of doing it is actually provide some value. Say, hey, I saw your blog post, or I saw this YouTube video. Here are my thoughts. I think here's like how I differ from you. Like here's like an interesting thing that I learned from my experience, which differs from what you did. Or like here's how it agrees with what you talked about in your video. Now all of a sudden, oh, this person actually cares. This person has something interesting to say. Now I'm way more likely to click into your profile and understand what's your background. So that's like the big secret I would say to LinkedIn is you should almost never be talking about yourself in that first message. It should always be about the person who you're sending the message to. And one way you can test it is how many times do you have the word I in the cold message versus you? So if you start off saying, I'm looking for a job, no, that's not going to work. If you start off saying, hey, Rahul, like your recent video about how long to stay at a tech company was super interesting. Here's my thinking. That starts to become way more interesting. And then the other thing, I think YK, you had a really good point. These last 2, I think these are tremendously important as a software engineer because they actually teach you how to be a good software engineer, right? Like if you're making open source contributions, you know how to work on a team, you know how to get buy-in, you know how to, land code in a production code base. That's huge. And similarly with the large side project. But I think one of the frustrating things about interviewing is that the skill you need to pass the interview is often different from the skill you need to succeed on the job. And so I think what happens is that some people will think, oh, well, I know that if I have a big side project or a big open source contribution, that makes me a good engineer. That's probably true. Yeah, you're going to be a great engineer. But good engineers often will not get the interview. And so you have to kind of be really precise about, like, for people who are watching, are you getting the interview? And if you are, then the way you prepare is very different. And if you're not getting the interview, what you should do is also very different. So that's actually the next thing I want to talk about, which is how you got the interview, either through one of the tactics in the previous slide or, some company want to take a bet on you. Then at that point, the most important thing you can do is data structure and algorithm preparation. And this is especially important for junior roles. One of the things that is kind of interesting is that my experience has been that the more senior you get, the less important DSA becomes, right? So like if you're a junior candidate, the biggest thing that they're trying to evaluate you on is how much can you code, how much do you understand the fundamentals. The more senior you are, the more you can lean on your experience at other companies, and the more you can lean on your system design and architecture background. And so, especially if you're junior, you have to spend most of your time preparing for DSA. And one thing I'll say is that if you're at the point now where you're getting 3 or 4 or 5 different recruiters who are replying to you and saying, hey, yeah, we'd love to chat. Why don't you come in for an interview? At that point, you should, unless you really have a good reason, you should stop working on your side project or your open source contribution, and you should spend the vast majority of your time just focused on preparing for your algorithm interview, because your side project will not help you at all really in the interview. You should be able to talk about it for sure, but you making it an extra bit of like having an extra bit of polish won't really distinguish you from getting the job or not. And so that's what I was referring to earlier, where it's like there are two very distinct phases. Phase one is, are you getting the interview? If the answer is no, then you should focus all of your time on building up trust with the hiring manager through credentials, through open source, through side projects, through a referral. Once you get the interview, then your focus should shift almost completely in the other direction to now be very focused on, Glassdoor, looking at different questions that are asked, and LeetCode. So I have a couple different tips here in terms of the biggest mistakes I've seen in terms of people preparing for their FAANG interview. The first is make it a habit. I think some people have this idea of, okay, I'm going to do 4 hours of preparation on Saturday and Sunday, but then Monday through Friday, I'm kind of busy with my own job. I'm not really going to do very much work. And I can promise you, you're going to be way more effective if you are actually able to do a small amount of DSA preparation every day. So even half an hour a day is going to give you much more retention of the knowledge compared to like 4 hours on a Saturday. The other thing is that, take breaks. And it sounds obvious, but I think so many people want to white knuckle their way through and basically burn out their brain. Like for me, at least, I don't know about other people, but for me, like an hour of really deep creative work for my brain is a lot. And if I go beyond that too much, then I can start to tell that I'm going to get slower or I'm not going to be able to do as much. And so make sure you add that into your own schedule, and also realize that that's how interviews work, right? Every company I interviewed at, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, they all have the same format. It's probably going to be like a 45 or 50-minute interview, and then you'll have a 5 or 10-minute break before the next one, right? So that they build in this idea of bathroom breaks or mental breaks in the interview, right? So why would you now deviate from that in your preparation? This is a big one, finding a buddy, because what I found is that a lot of people will prepare for their DSA. Like they'll either get LeetCode or cracking the coding interview or Algo Expert, whatever is the service that you want to use, and they'll do it in isolation. And that turned out to be a huge mistake because the actual interview is not done in isolation. You always will have someone who's going to be watching you on the whiteboard, or more recently on Zoom or CoderPad, whatever, like a remote interview. And so the skill of doing well in isolation and writing it on a piece of paper on your desk is very different from the actual interview. And so again, the idea is that you want to minimize the number of variables between the interview performance and your at-home performance. And the way you do that is like have a buddy and have them actually tell you, like like you should be talking them through what you're thinking and how you're approaching the problem. And I think having a buddy also forces you to not take shortcuts. Like, there's some level of accountability that way, that people will not, you can't just cheat if you have your friend watching you and studying with you. Yeah. Any thoughts on this? Okay.
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate the approach of, first focusing on getting interviews and then getting better at interviews. I mean, there will be some overlaps, but I, really appreciate the breakdown. And finding a buddy, I can speak to that too. The way I approached it was, I practiced it on my own, LeetCode and stuff like that a lot first. And then when I was ready to interview, start interviewing, I just asked a bunch of my friends, hey, can you mock interview me? And they're not professional software engineers necessarily, but it is helpful to, try to replicate the actual interview environment.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think of it similar to rubber duck debugging, right? Like even if like you brought up a good example of, even if your friend is not a software engineer, it still has a ton of value for you to be able to like go through the paces of explaining your thought process. The same exact thing applies for rubber duck debugging, right? So like for people who aren't familiar, the idea of rubber duck debugging is like you have a rubber duck or like some toy animal on your desk and you talk to the toy animal about a bug that you're facing. And oftentimes the act of verbalizing what's in your head and getting it out in a coherent way to a rubber duck or to a friend, that itself will make you reflect in a deeper way. And oftentimes you'll find the issue that way. And so like same thing here, right? If you find a rubber duck or a friend or a buddy, then I think there's a much, much higher chance of you actually being able to um, translate what's the jumble of stuff happening in your head into a coherent thing on the interview. And that actually is a big part of how you're being evaluated. One more thing I want to add here is another common mistake I see people make a lot is that they think that there are particular coding languages, programming languages, which are going to help them a lot in the interview. So for example, they say, oh, Python is much shorter and more concise. I'm going to 2 weeks before the interview or 1 month before the interview, I'm going to switch all my preparation into Python. Even though I know Java really well, I'm going to switch over into Python. And that's almost always a mistake because there are kind of two things that are being evaluated in an interview. One is how quickly can you arrive at the correct answer? And second is how well do you actually know what you're writing down on the whiteboard? And so I think the idea is that people look at criteria number one, and they look like Python is going to be much shorter, much faster. It's more powerful in some ways compared to Java. So I can write the code faster and arrive more quickly at the solution using Python. And that's probably true. I mean, Java is a verbose language. Many of these other ones that people are familiar with, like C++, it will take longer for you to write out. But I think where people make the mistake is that in number two, if you're switching to Python just for the sake of interviews, you're not going to be able to explain what you wrote or why you are using certain functions with as much depth. And a big, big part of interviews when I evaluate people is, does it feel like they've memorized a solution and they're just regurgitating some memorized thing in their head? Or are they properly able to communicate to me the pros and cons of what they've done and how the language really works behind the abstraction? And I don't think you can do that in 2 weeks of preparation with Python if you just switched. If you've been doing Python for years, yeah, for sure, go with Python. But if you've been doing Java for years, I would highly recommend you stick with what you know best, because a big part of the interview will be kind of testing your depth of understanding of that language. Okay, so here's like my algorithm. Okay, every single time I do a DSA problem, I have like this 4-step process. Number one is clarify the problem. Right? Clarify the problem means, hey, even if it's a simple one, I always, before I do anything, I say it back to the interviewer. And I actually make that kind of obvious. I say, hey, okay, let me say it back to you to make sure I understand. I actually use that language. And I think that usually goes a long way in making sure that the interviewer and I are on the same page. The second thing I do is before, again, I write any code at all, is confirm my approach. So I'll say, okay, here's my understanding. Here's how the first thing that comes to mind is this. And then I'll say, what do you think of that? Like a big part of this is engaging the interview and kind of getting hints from them. Like, do they want you to code that up, or is there a more optimal solution that they want you to have a discussion about and then code that up? And so you should wait for some sort of verbal agreement or confirmation from the interviewer before you write any code. And that's a big mistake that some people are so eager, they're in a rush to write code that they'll just dive right in. And as the interviewer, I feel like I'm left behind. I'm like, oh, I don't really know what you're doing or why you're doing it. Just you're going rogue and doing something on your own. And the fourth thing I always remember when I'm doing these interviews is done is better than perfect, right? Time is of the essence, and it's way better to just get something done rather than wasting the whole interview trying to find the optimal solution. And you can acknowledge that too. Like if you feel pretty confident in your brute force approach, like the dumb approach, then what you should do is just say, okay, hey, here's an idea I have. Let me write the pseudocode for it. Let me put this down, and then I'll walk through some of the downsides of it, algorithmically, why it's not that optimal. What do you think of that? And then I'll wait and say, they'll say, okay, yeah, that sounds good. Go ahead and do it. And then I'll write that down. So at least now I have the basic solution. I got partial credit. I got some amount of, I was able to prove to the interviewer to some degree that I know what I'm doing. And then I can have a really deeper discussion about, why is this solution insufficient and how we can improve it. And then the last thing here is around arrogance and taking hints from the interviewer. So there are kind of two things that are being evaluated in a DSA round, in an algorithm question. One is, did you get the algorithm? But there's another thing too, which people may not understand or realize as much, is I'm also checking, do I like this person, right? Like, do I want to work with this person? And so if you are blowing off my suggestions or you're like directly going into the coding and I feel like you're not taking me along with you, like you're basically ignoring what I'm saying, or even worse, like you're disagreeing. Like I'm saying, oh, YK, I think you should approach it this way. Or like, I think that your solution has a bug here. And you blow it off and say, no, it doesn't have a bug. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong as the interviewee. You're basically you ruin the relationship. And because you've ruined the relationship, you've now ruined the interview. And so a big part of interviewing is making sure that you get the right answer while also, making the interviewer feel like they are part of the journey with you. Anything you want to add here? Okay.
Yeah, just quickly, I really love the thing you said about, keeping an open dialogue with the interviewer. That would be my approach too, and that was my approach when I was interviewing. Like types of phrases I would use is something like, so I have this brute force solution in mind. Just explain that. I'm thinking of writing the code because we don't have that much time, or I can go ahead and try to think of a better solution.
Yeah.
And then look at the interviewer, look at their facial expression. That might sound kind of silly, but kind of get hints from the interviewer to see like what you should be doing.
Yeah. And actually that's one of the things that, to be totally honest with you, I feel like I do feel bad for people who have been interviewing during the pandemic, because what you said is so important. Like when you're in an interview, it really is a dialogue. It's a two-way street. I want to understand from you, are you engaged? Are you happy? Like, do you feel like there might be a bug? Like I can usually tell that pretty well in person. If we're sitting in the same room, I know I can kind of read your body language. But when you're a small box on a screen, it's actually much harder for me to get that signal. And in fact, like it's kind of sad but true. A lot of the times the interviewer won't even be engaged. Like they'll be on their phone. Well, they'll be reading the news on the side, and you can't tell because like they're like dialing in, right? And so I do think that's one of the unfortunate realities of interviewing in a remote world, is it's harder to make that connection with the interviewer. And so that just makes it even more important that you have to really go above and beyond to make sure you're connecting and getting that communication in with them. Okay, so that was pretty much it in terms of what I had done. Let me share a couple other high-level ideas of what worked for me. So I got 5 offers in 2013, like I mentioned. I still failed a bunch of interviews in that year. And so the strategy is I knew that there were a couple companies that were less important to me. And so I interviewed there first. I basically learned, okay, here's how I need to get back in the mode of interviewing. Here's like what concepts I am doing well at. Here's what concepts I need a lot more work in. And by the time I got to Facebook, Google, Microsoft, we were like the 3 ones I really cared about. I felt way better. And so that's like one tactic in general. What you should do is stack up your interviews such that the ones that you care about are a little bit later. And the other thing I'll say is when you actually do the interviews with the companies you care about, then you should have them all be within a short time period. So my most recent experience in 2017, before I joined Facebook, I literally had 1 week where I had 5 on-site interviews. Like literally Monday through Friday, I had all day interviews every single day at Uber, Airbnb, Facebook, Stripe, like back to back to back. And it was kind of exhausting. I mean, no getting around that fact. Like it's exhausting and a bit stressful because you're in this judgment mode so often. But the big benefit of that is negotiation. And I'm not sure how much we're going to talk about this one, but this is a whole topic, at some point we should dive into either now, or if people are interested, I can talk about it later. But the way you negotiate is by having leverage. The way you have leverage is by having multiple offers. The way you have multiple offers at the same time is by interviewing at the same time in a short window. And so like what some people will do, which is a really bad idea, is they'll like interview once at Facebook this month, and then next month they'll interview at Google. And then the next month after that, they'll interview at Microsoft. And you basically completely negged yourself, because there's no way that the recruiter from Facebook is going to wait 2 months for you to hear back from Google or Microsoft and then negotiate with you. And so for me, I was able to get literally like a $75,000 increase in one of the offers just because I was able to negotiate them with another. And so just be mindful of the order of your interviews and the time period in which they're happening. Yeah, so that was all I had in terms of getting offers at FAANG. Anything else you want to dive in there? Okay, otherwise we can go into diving into a code base.
Yeah, let's talk about diving into a new code base.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, let me set the context here, and then I'm happy to share my screen because I actually have an actual project that we can go through together. The context is that I was at Facebook for 4.5 years. And one of the things about Facebook, which I loved, and this is still true today, is that the idea of code ownership is pretty relaxed at Meta. And what that means is there's no real concept of, you can't touch this module or this file. Like if you want to, and you feel like you're making a change that's additive, like it's positive, then it doesn't matter if you're a backend engineer or a front-end engineer. You can just go in, check out that module, and start to make a change. And so as a result of that, I had that mentality built into me. And so I wrote code in 6 different languages at my time at Facebook. Let me just tell you what they were. Java, Kotlin, Hack, Python, JavaScript, and C. And so if you're not able to quickly dive in and understand the code base and understand the language, at least to a bare bones extent, you would not survive. And so by doing that process so many times, like literally 6 times of diving in and making a change and getting it reviewed, I came up with 4 different tactics that are really effective for learning a new code base. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. So let me just set up my screen share one more time, and then we can go from there. But yeah, if you want to share. Okay, so what you're seeing now is Android Studio. And what I'm thinking would be really cool, actually, is here's a Android project that I built. I'll give you the context there. I'm going to show you the 4 different tactics for ramping up on a code base on this open source Android project that I have. So this is called the My Memory game. So it's an app I built for my YouTube channel. It was like a tutorial I built like 1.5 years ago. And the idea is you're basically trying to find pairs of cards, right? So these 2 cards don't match, so now I'm going to find this briefcase, and then here's the other briefcase. Okay, it's a simple game. So let's pretend that our company is building this app, and you're a brand new developer. How do you now quickly understand the code base? Yeah, and this is a good point. We're talking about Android here, but the whole point of what I'm saying is that this should apply across language, across framework, across company, right? So I have 4 tips here. Ramping up. So number 1 is start running the code.
I think if you could zoom a little bit, that might be helpful.
For sure. Yep. Is that better?
Yep, thanks.
Okay, so the number 1 biggest thing that people can do is start running the code as soon as possible. And this might sound obvious, but what happens is, especially when you get to a big company, running the code is actually non-trivial. Even running the code and getting your code to execute might require setting up some service, setting up your dev environment, getting a permission to run something locally, right? Because these systems that we're talking about at Google or Facebook, which is, YK, you and I will be familiar with, these are huge, huge systems, right? And so what you should not do, and this is what happens to a lot of people who I've mentored, is they spend okay, let me spend the next week reading the code and trying to understand it in my head. And then I'll run it and it'll make a lot of sense to me. That never works. The way you understand the code is by running the code and then modifying it, which is what we'll talk about next. So in this example, it's actually very simple, right? Literally all I have to do is I have to go up here and I have to run app. And then down here at the bottom of the screen, it's harder to tell, but Gradle is a build system for Android that's taking all the source code, compiling it, turning it into something called an APK and deploying it on the device. So now we're running it. Very simple, right? But even understanding that is super valuable, because what I just said is that there's a build system called Android, build system called Gradle on Android. And so you should probably know what that means. Like, don't be a master in Gradle, but like at least Google for it and say, hey, what does Gradle do? What is the command that's being run behind the scenes when I hit this button? Like, that's the kind of basic stuff you should be able to do. The other thing is, when I talk about running the code, I also mean like make any change that you can actually see a result in. So like what that might mean is like, I'm going to add a log statement. I'm going to put a breakpoint somewhere, and I'm going to see that breakpoint get hit. If you can do that, you're already halfway there in terms of understanding like new code base. But what you shouldn't do is like read the code in isolation and hope that it'll magically make sense to you. That almost never works, especially these big companies. You need to actually start running the code as quickly as possible. So that's what we've done, right? I'm a new engineer. I'm on this Android team of this company, which is making a memory game. I ran the code, and then I'm able to see it. And the other thing that you should probably learn is, okay, where are all the log messages being displayed, right? So here, there's something called logcat, and then I go to the corresponding app and I see all the log messages, right? So this is really important, right? If you don't know where the log messages are being stored, that's step one. You should know where that is, and you should know how to run it. Okay, so then step number 2 is to intentionally break things and understand how. Is that legible for you? Okay, you got it, right?
Yes.
Cool. So this next one is really important, because I think another failure mode that I've seen so often is that you're coming up on a new code base and you want to make a change, right? Presumably, like at Facebook, every time I made, like I was ramping up on Kotlin, or then I was ramping up on Python or JavaScript, like there was usually some existing code there. And my objective was, I want to modify it or improve it in some way, which satisfies the requirements for my project. And that's usually 2 or 3 steps down the road. Step 2, or I guess I should like step 1. Step 2 is like, before you make your change, you have to understand the current state of the logic. If you don't understand the way things are now, how could you possibly make a change to make it better, right? And so, for example, here, let's say that I'm in the memory game, and then there's like one class here called memory game. And so, I mean, the details aren't important, but roughly this memory game class is the core logic for our application. It's like all the logic for how do we handle the memory game. And so, one idea is, hey, we have this line here called chosen images. We're randomizing some icons, which are the icons that we show here, and then we're taking a couple of them. So like you have 20 images, we're taking 4 of them and making those all the icons on the board. So let's say what happens if we change this to 2, right? I'm hard coding some number here. I run the app. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm just fooling around. I'm literally just like making a change and saying, okay, what happens if I do that? So I don't know if you saw that, but the application got deployed and then immediately it crashed. And so I think the really important thing to do here is understand, why did it break? And so like if you're an Android developer, sorry, you'll know how to do this, right? And if you're not, you should learn. I'm going to filter for only error messages, and then go up to the top of the stack trace, and it says, oh, we got a fatal exception. There was an index out of bounds exception, index 4, size 4, right? So something broke because I'm trying to access a part of the array which doesn't exist. So now it's great. Like I can kind of dig into that a bit more and understand, okay, what does that mean? How is this, what line of code is this crashing on? It's called memory board adapter. And now I can make a connection between, hey, here's the relationship between this file and this other file. And if you build up that mapping in your head of here's how these different modules talk to each other, now you're really starting to understand how the code works. And now you'll be equipped to make your own code change. Okay. Step number 3 is land a low effort code change quickly. Okay, so the idea here is that another really common failure mode is that people think that they understand the project, which is good. And now they say, hey, I have this change I want to make. Let me go ahead and make it right now. And then they'll basically come up with a code change, which is like 500 lines. And then they expect all the people on that team to already understand it and review it. And that's a big mistake because I think for two reasons it's a big mistake. The first reason is that at these big companies where you have these large code bases, a big part of landing code is actually trust. And if you've never worked in my code before and you basically made a big change and now you're expecting me to review it, I am not going to be happy. Like you just basically came out of nowhere, made this big change, and now are expecting me to like understand it and review it without giving me much context or without like you haven't earned my trust yet. And so that's a big reason, number one. And number two is oftentimes things will happen in the process of making the code change that will be unexpected for you. And so my recommendation for everyone is I don't care how small, if it's just like adding a comment to a random place in the file, make that code change right now and land it. And so like, let me give you an example. I'm going to undo what we had before. So one really powerful technique that I've used for this is most IDEs, right? Most code editors will give you hints about where things are going wrong or like how you can improve the code. So it's hard for you to see probably, but if I hover over on line 14 here, Android Studio, which is the IDE that I'm using here, it's actually telling us assignment can be lifted out of if. It's like suggesting to us right now that, hey, here's a very simple code change that you could make. And so what I can do is I can hover over it and I can actually click this button. And so what that did, let me undo it just to make that more obvious. So we had this assignment to this list of memory cards here called cards. And so what we're doing is we're lifting the cards assignment out of the if statement. So this is like a very nice Kotlin feature, which is a language that we're using. And so, hey, that's great. So what I would do right now, literally, is I would say, hey, this is a great change. Let me make a commit for it and put it out for review. And if you do that, you're like, okay, wow, this person is meaningfully adding to the quality of the code base. And as a developer, you get a lot more insight onto how do you actually make the change? Like how do you put a code change out for review? How do you then land the commit into GitHub or Fabricator or whatever it is your code repository? And now you're going to be set up for success when you are actually doing your real change. So that's tip number 3. And then finally, my last tip is to understand the code hotspots. Okay, so the idea here is basically that when you enter into a company like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, these are companies that have tons and tons of developers and they've been around for a decade or more, right? And so there are going to be large parts of the code base which are dormant. And what I mean by that is basically there are going to be large parts of the code base that no one really understands or no one has touched in years. I don't know. Have you had that experience, Mike, like in any other companies that you've been at?
Yeah, it was actually a really painful experience for me because I needed to dive into that part of the code, and yeah, it was really hard.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so my advice is basically like, so generally, if you're new onto a team, you're not going to be making a change in one of those dormant parts of the code base. So I'm sorry you had that experience. I'm sure that was really painful for you. But like typically, people will be making a change in the area of the code which has already been actively being changed. And so one thing that I recommend for everyone is understand where are people actually making changes on the code. And so tactically, the way you do that is I might go into, let's say, like main activity, which is one of the main files. And there's depends on your IDE and depends on your environment. But in Android Studio, I'll show you like a really cool way. I can go to Git and then GitHub, and I can say, I can say current file and annotate with git blame. Okay. And so what this is doing is, I'm not sure if you can read it, but like on the left-hand side, it tells me when was this code modified, right? So you can see like a lot of the code was touched on November 1st. But then if I scroll down, like, okay, here's like a change on November 11th. And now I can click into it and say, okay, here's like the commit message. And so basically like what you're doing is you're trying to look at maybe the top half of the code has not been touched in like 2 years, but the bottom half of the file, like that function in the middle, that is being actively modified. So that's like a really good thing to understand. So now what you can do is go into that code change, understand the test plan, understand the context of that change, because presumably the author would have left that for you. And then that gives you a really solid understanding of, okay, how is this code base evolving, right? Because it's not enough just to have a snapshot in time of the code base. You also want to understand how will this code evolve in the next month, in the next quarter, in the next 6 months, right? And the way you have that understanding is by looking at the blame and also by talking to people. So that was it. The 4 things: start writing the code as quickly as possible, break things, understand how they broke. Number 3, make a simple code change like the one that we had where we pulled out the assignment of the variable from the if statement. And number 4, understand what are the parts of the code base that are actually being changed. And that's, if you do these 4 things, I think you're ahead of 95% of developers in terms of ramping up.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this is a really important skill, but something that's not quite taught as much as other skills. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And then one more thing, I'll just add quickly. One other part of this that I wanted to share, which is kind of adjacent but related, is this idea of how do you share your work? And so one thing that I think I've done a relatively good job of in my career, and I've been rewarded for it, is being able to actually showcase my work in a meaningful way. And so like the project that we just looked at, it's called My Memory. It's open source on GitHub. And so people are free to check it out. But like one thing I want to call out is I have this README file here. And the README file does a really good job of explaining what exactly does this project do, right? So like I have a GIF here, which shows you like in video format, essentially, like here's what the project does, here's how it works. And I have like a icon to get on Google Play. I have like very clear instructions. And then in case people are curious, here's what the actual README file looks like, the markdown. But I think just going the extra mile and spending an extra hour on your project, not just your project, like in this example, I'm making a README for the whole project, but literally every code change you make, spend an extra 15 minutes making that code change really readable and explaining why you're making that change. And if you do that every time, people will start to trust you a lot more. So rather than just like throwing something over the fence, you're now taking the time to explain, here's what I'm doing and here's why I'm doing it. And here's like a screenshot. And you make it really easy for me as the code reviewer to understand what you've done. So I just wanted to have that at the end of just like, the only way that you really have impact on the world is if other people around you understand what you're doing, right? And so the way you make it easy for people to understand what you're doing is by having a README that looks like this, where you have a very clear breakdown of what you've done and what libraries you've used, what screenshots you have, how does your app work. And so that's something that I think everyone should strive to do, even though it takes a little bit of extra time.
Nice. One quick thing I wanted to add is people should be able to do git blame on GitHub too, right?
Oh yeah, totally. I'll just show you a quick example if you're interested.
Sure.
So let me just pull up a random file here.
If you could zoom in, I think that'll be helpful.
Yes, I'll zoom in too. So here, like there's a button called blame, right? I click on that. Yes, so this is in fact, this might be even better. So thanks for the suggestion. Okay, like this is even better, right? Like now I can very clearly see, hey, here's the author. In this case, it's me. But like many times it'll be like the tech lead. And so now it's, hey, like, oh, hey, tech lead, you made this change a year ago. I don't understand why you made this change. Like, can you please help me understand? So like doing git blame like this is a very, very powerful technique to be able to understand what happened. So yeah, this is a really good idea. I like this.
Yeah. Personally, I use both my editor and GitHub, or whatever the code repository platform is for reading code. So I think people should be able to like switch back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is like you and I definitely know, Mike, and people who are looking for their first job, you have to understand is that all of these things are tools, but the underlying concept won't change, right? Like what we just talked about is going to be applicable across Codebase, across framework. So like at Facebook, for example, we use Mercurial, right? Mercurial is a different kind of version control system. It's different from Git. And so yeah, the commands are going to be different. And I had to learn that. If you're going to join Meta, you're going to have to learn Mercurial, not Git. But as long as you understand why you're doing it and like what is the intention of having blame and what are you looking for, then learning the command for Mercurial versus Git, that's easy. what's like more important as a developer is understanding what is the underlying tactics and underlying principles that you're trying to achieve.
Cool. I think you need to go soon, Rahul.
Yeah, I think I have like 2 or 3 more minutes. If there's anything we want to wrap up, I'm happy to answer any questions. Or if there's anything else, like on your end, happy to share.
Yeah, if you have any last words, feel free to share. And if you're in the audience, feel free to share any questions you have, and I might be able to, we might be able to cover some of them or one of them maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the one thing I'll just mention, I think there were a couple questions I got DM'd after you made your announcement of this live stream, like about like Y Combinator, right? So Y Combinator, for people who don't know, is this really well-known startup program. It's an accelerator, and we're actively doing Y Combinator right now with my company called Taro. And so I just want to share 2 things that I think are really powerful from Y Combinator that I think can be applicable, whether you're doing a startup, whether you're looking for a job, whether you're on a job as a software engineer. I think the 2 things that I got from YC that are really beneficial are, number 1, a lot of questioning around why can you not do it faster, and number 2, a lot of accountability. So number 1 means like what often happened is like people will, the YC part, like I'll go into the office hours and the YC partner will say like, you're launching your product on Hacker News or on Product Hunt or whatever it is. Why have you not launched yesterday? Like, what is preventing you from launching like yesterday? And so like you have to now come up with a good answer of like why it's not working. And so that's been really powerful, just like always having that urgency. And number 2 is accountability. So every 2 weeks we have a office hour where we have to set goals and then achieve them. And if you don't hit your goal, then it's kind of a shame. It's like there's some element of social shaming that happens. And so that's been also really effective for me to like achieve what we've done in YC.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's probably it for the stream, but just wanted to quickly mention, I think accountability is important for like developers in general too, like prepare for coding interviews or whatever. That's why I guess that's another reason why having a buddy is really helpful.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, having some accountability partner, whether it's a friend or a coach or a boss even, I mean, it's so much more effective to really achieve your potential compared to, just working on your own. But yeah, so I think that was it. It's really nice chatting, YK, and hopefully people who are watching got some benefit out of this. I'm really happy to connect with anyone. So I'm pretty active on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm rpandey1234, and I think I'm also on YouTube. So feel free to connect on YouTube, and always open to chatting further.
Yeah, sounds good. We've been getting a lot of comments saying it's been really helpful and insightful. So really appreciate that. And yeah, maybe we should do part 2 at some point to cover, maybe like startups and getting promoted as a software engineer.
Yeah, no, I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. Getting promoted as an engineer, the startup experience, more about negotiation is a whole other topic. Either I'm happy to come on again, YK, if you want, or we can do a part 2 on my channel as well. Whatever.
Yeah, actually, part 2 on your channel might be really cool too.
Let's do it. Okay, cool. Well, really nice to talk for almost an hour. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. See you all.